June, when the Nordic Baltic Benelux prime ministers met in The Hague. And of course, there is not an interest of these countries to fragment Europe or to split somehow Europe, now acting in groupings. But the idea is that by on like-minded issues, which can join us, can add additional input to the future of Europe, to ideas of 2019 Commission new programming, so just that this region of countries where countries actually share the values and the liberal way of seeing the future of Europe, the trade liberalization, also digital single market and internal market as such. So on these big things, the countries are united. And here I want to just briefly come back to my dissertation when my conclusion at that time, and I'm happy that 10 years later, and I can see it in action, that I actually stated there is not a Nordic-Baltic coalition, and there is not Nordic-Baltic alignment across one policy field, that there's always the same outcome or same position paper, but that on political space, on a bigger, larger picture, on the future vision, there is a potential, because all these countries can play a role and create a critical mass. So there's a need of grouping to act together to really bring the idea forward. As Latvia, as also mentioned by Estonia, we want to be core player in Europe. So for us, this leadership is very important. And I think Baltic countries are very much really therefore treasuring this Nordic cooperation, Nordic-Baltic cooperation plus on issues where we are like-minded with others, so that we can really be framing the ideas. And if you allow me, just a final aspect that I wanted to mention about potential in diplomatic interaction. And now I will speak about Nordic-Baltic 8. So there is an interesting paradox. The further away from the region, the stronger the unity on these countries acting together. It doesn't say that there is no unity inside, but we use the potential of this unity, perception of our power, when we are outside. And this, in practice, is implemented through different meetings that Nordic-Baltic countries organize together, also inviting guests and host country politicians or government officials, explaining our positions, but also being introduced by their positions. And Norway is always part of this. And I think it's very important also to showcase the region, the unity of region, and sometimes it goes even to the very creative ideas. Why not to organize a joint reception for Nordic-Baltic 8? And then what would you advise, which date would be most appropriate? Because we have like national days across the year. And in one of the countries when this idea was actually implemented, it was Midsummer Eve. So I think there is a huge potential of the Nordic-Baltic in action outside, because we are seen as a group, and it's, to some extent, it's a red carpet from our countries, for our countries.
Thank you very much, Ilse. You would expect, of course, a diplomat to give a positive spin to the issues at hand. If you could switch places, Marlene. It's on. Oh, okay. I didn't want to put this in a very negative light, but there are differences, and I'm sure we hear more about that now. Of course, what would be interesting to hear is what comes out of this is that no member state is statically positioned within the European Union as a result of exogenous and endogenous shocks within the EU. These almost move as electrons, have been re-energized in a way, and Denmark in particular seems to be too much isolated, that it's now perhaps ready to move?
Move where? No. Thank you very much, and thank you to Christy for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. It's not my first time in Estonia, but almost. I actually had time to walk a bit around yesterday, and yes, amazingly beautiful city. I was invited to say a little bit about Denmark and the positioning of Denmark, and we already heard from our foreign minister yesterday, former foreign minister, one could only wish he was still, about Denmark and our situation and Europe more broadly. I was actually struck by the title of this conference, and I think I want to start there because it says a little bit about Denmark. So the title is the Nordic Baltic Visions. And the question is, of course, if Denmark has any visions for Europe. And I remember a small anecdote that I'm sure many in the room will probably also remember when President Macron was first sort of moving the table in order to present his views. He was just elected. There was a meeting, I think it was in Warsaw, I'm not quite sure. It was not on the table that he should present his visions for Europe, but he did, of course, he insisted. After that, the Danish Prime Minister came out and was interviewed by one of our most well-known Danish journalists from Brussels. And he was asked, so what do you think about Macron's visions for Europe? And the Danish Prime Minister said, I don't like visions at all. I would prefer rugbrødsarbejde. And I don't know if anyone in the room know what rugbrød is, but rugbrød is something very rough, tough you can eat. I know you have it in Estonia as well, black bread. And I remember Ole Ryborg, who is the Danish correspondent, saying, I don't know how to translate rugbrød into French. But the idea was, of course, that Denmark was really afraid of what this new fancy president would bring along and how it would pressure us into taking some kind of position about how we saw the European Union developing. And since I'm not a diplomat, fortunately, I can be pretty direct in my analysis of Denmark, and I will be. Because the Danish Prime Minister was, of course, not the only one being very nervous about Macron's visions for Europe. Also, the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, he said when he was asked the same question, what do you think about the visions? He said, if you have visions, you should go to the doctor. I think it says a little bit about the kind of unease, I would say, that Denmark has with the whole new European situation, not just with the French president that actually takes the European project seriously and wants to move it somewhere, but also with the UK, of course, leaving. I mean, in the Danish narrative, the UK has, in many respects, been the slow-moving boat that we could hide behind. So they have taken all the big battles in Brussels, and we could sort of crawl under the table and pretend that it was not us who asked for this XYZ. It was the Brits who were the impossible child in the class, and we were just hiding a little bit behind the UK. So now that the UK is probably leaving, we do not know yet, I'm still not convinced, Denmark will all of a sudden have to be the naughty boy itself. And that's not always so funny when you're used to being looked upon as the good pupil in the class, the one who always implements EU law on time, like all the rest of the Nordic countries, and I'm sure the Baltics as well. It is a very difficult time right now, and that's very, very clear in the public debate in Denmark, that we sort of do not really know where to position ourselves. There was a very interesting survey analysis by European Council of Foreign Relations that I would like to dwell on just for a second. Came out only a week ago. I wrote in one of the biggest newspapers in Denmark. I have a column, and I wrote about that on Saturday, and the headline was, Denmark has no friends in the EU, and it's our own fault. That was my headline. And actually, summing up the result of this analysis, it said that a lot of countries may believe that they have friends and coalition partners and so on, but in the end, they may not have as many as they believe. And what the study did was to ask 700 diplomats. And when I'm talking about diplomats, I'm not just talking about those in Brussels. I'm talking about also in the capitals. And they were all asked to, you may be familiar with this study because they do it again and again, every second year, I think. They ask diplomats to rank 5 countries, anonymously, of course, without knowing how the other countries rank, that they believe are their most prominent partners, important partners in the EU. And then they put this all into a big machine, and they turn it around, and out comes a lot of interesting, numbers and statistics, and who's friend with whom, and who believes they're friend with someone that do not really think of themselves as friend. And this analysis was very, very interesting for Denmark, because we have been sort of soaked into this understanding that apart from the Nordics, of course, our prime friend, we thought, was Germany. And number 2 was Sweden. And number 3 was the UK. It might still be our good friends, but when you ask the so-called good friends how they look at Denmark, they saw things a bit differently. For instance, the Swedes, they ranked Denmark as the 5th best friend. The Baltics were above. And several other countries, the Dutch and the Germans and so on. And the Brits that we had also ranked quite high, only 2% of the Brits thought that Danes were important friends. That was a bit disappointing, but now they're leaving, it might not matter so much. And the funny thing was, of course, Germany. Germany didn't even mention Denmark as a friend. Right? So the ones we believe are our very, very, very best friend do not see us as a friend at all. So it was kind of depressing and maybe a wake-up call for Denmark in terms of how do we build new coalitions in this world that is in turmoil, and the UK leaving, and is it the Nordic countries, is it the Baltic and Nordic coalition that we are going to engage more with, or how do we deal with these things? The question is, of course, what this study actually tells us. It tells us something about being marginalized in the EU. We have really come to believe, for it's 40 years, it's more than 40 years, we had our opt-outs. We used to have 4, but we actually only have 3, because the opt-out we had on citizenship, EU citizenship, you cannot have an opt-out on that, because citizenship is supplementary to national citizenship. So already in the Amsterdam Treaty, it was put into the treaty that citizenship, EU citizenship, is not replacing national citizenship, but is actually a supplement. So it did not matter anymore, and so we have the defense now, and the justice and home affairs, and of course the euro. But we had come to believe, even in among diplomats in Copenhagen, and among opinion makers, politicians, that, well, we are doing quite okay, you know. We are very pragmatic. We are incredibly good at implementing EU law on time. We are never taken to court. Very rarely happens. And we are incredibly well prepared for the meetings. So the understanding, when my students went to Brussels and interviewed, you know, people, so how is Denmark doing? It was almost always, the response you got was that, oh, you're so good diplomats, it's amazing, you're so well prepared, you have all the ideas in advance, and so on. So there was this kind of understanding that well, we try to get around these opt-outs. But I think that this study by the European Council of Foreign Relations tells us that we really do have very few friends. And therefore, hooking up with the Nordics and doing a bit more there might be very a good strategy. Also, listening yesterday to Uffe Ellemann-Jensen, if you take all these countries together, we are actually quite a substantial bloc. You know, we do have some weight. And I also agree with you that we are, to a large degree, seen as a bloc. We are looked upon as someone who have the same welfare state, we have same ideas on climate, on environment, maybe not on refugees, but that's another story. Next question, how will Denmark position itself when the UK leaves and we have this new Europe? Where the Eurozone, at least that's my own personal prediction, it will, within 10 years, be, no matter whether you want it or not, be the de facto European Union. I think we have to face that. I think we have to face that despite all attempts by out countries to sort of beg and please and urge the Germans not to leave us outside, I think there's a dynamic and a logic in the cooperation. They have a common destiny, the group of Eurozone countries. I don't think we can get around that. I think the Euro is the worst. Denmark is outside. I think it's the most important opt-out we have. I think it's really absolutely the most important opt-out for Denmark to get rid of. It's not just because I'm married to an economist working in Brussels, in an EU institution, but it is actually because we also saw it during the crisis, the financial crisis, that the Eurozone, it's sort of everything circles around this. So will Denmark ever join? I don't think so. I think that it's actually, and unfortunately, a dead issue. We may enter the banking union. I will not exclude that because, why? We don't have a referendum on that. So the fact that we don't have a referendum could mean that if there is a very good argument and a very good report which is underway, and a very courageous government, I'm not sure about the last part, but if we did have that, Denmark could eventually enter the banking union, even though when you talk to economists, they simply say, a lot of them, it doesn't make sense not to be part of the euro. I mean, if you want to be in the banking union, you of course have to. So maybe that could be some kind of step towards the euro, but I'm still not convinced it will happen in my lifetime. Defense opt-out, in that part, Denmark tries to compensate in all other ways we can. You know, we go to war almost trigger happy, I would say. A lot of my colleagues in the UK who have investigated their own participation in wars the past 10, 15 years, they wonder why is there no investigation in Denmark, why is there no questioning? I mean, Danes love to go to war. We have a lot of good soldiers. We are out there, up there. We are keen to help. So I think we are trying to compensate for the defense opt-out. It becomes, of course, more and more comical because why, if some kind of mission has a a blue helmet, or EU helmet, we're not allowed to join, but if it has a UN helmet, we can join. It becomes comical, but as in many other respects with the opt-outs, when you ask the Danes, they say, fix it. I mean, it's a problem for you, civil servants. It's not a problem for us. We want to stick to these opt-outs. And what is the problem with Denmark and opt-outs? I think it is because the population has this idea of sovereignty as a zero-sum game. We could learn a lot from Macron when he says that sovereignty should be, we should look at European sovereignty. I think he said it in his Sorbonne speech. We should try to start a discussion and a discourse talking about Europe as something that we are part of in a completely different way than we have been previously. Because if we think of European sovereignty as opposed to American, as opposed to Russian sovereignty and all other bodies outside Europe and countries, we might gradually be able to change our minds and understand that it's no longer makes sense to talk about a small nation's own sovereignty. Because look at the UK. Do they become more sovereign of leaving the EU? Or do they lose sovereignty? I constantly argue when I'm debating in Denmark, and that happens quite often on TV and other places, that you lose sovereignty by not being part of the EU. But that kind of discourse has not sort of elevated itself to the political level. So in my opinion, we still have, unfortunately, and I'm sorry to Uffe, you're no longer in politics, so I can say it, we have some very uncourageous politicians who make the big mistake that I think also David Cameron did, that he tried to feed the pig on market day. When he wanted people all of a sudden to vote Remain, he had for 15 years been speaking bad about Europe. And I think the same thing is happening in Denmark and has been happening in Denmark, that we constantly blame Europe for everything. You also, again and again, among journalists, hear the saying, the EU has not solved the refugee crisis, the migration crisis. But who is the EU? Who's the EU? It's us. We are the EU. We are the ones who have not solved it. It's not the institutions that are not coming up with solutions and suggestions constantly. They've been doing that for 15 years. But the member states, the heads of state and government are not listening, and then they go back home and blame Brussels. So it's incredibly tiring to listen to this all the time about the EU being blamed for all the problems that we as countries cannot live up to.
So, can I interrupt you there?
Yeah.
So we can have a discussion. I'll invite you to my seat. I take away your last point on sovereignty actually as a bridge perhaps for discussion. So please.
Can I just say one thing as my last comment? That now we discussed what can the Nordic Baltics do, contribute to Europe. What I have been really surprised about is why nobody in this part of the world speak up against illiberal democracy. We pride ourselves of being democracy and giving away peace prizes and free speech and cartoon crisis. What do you have? But I haven't heard one single senior politician, apart from Uffe, of course, say anything about the slide to liberalism. And I think we have something to give there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marlene. Thanks to all the speakers on the panel. Sorry to rush you. Thanks to all the speakers. I'm conscious of time, of course, and I would like to not have just a debate on this side, but also with you. So please try and catch my eye if you want to come in with any question or observation you may have. I mean, a lot of issues have been thrown up. Of course, the characterization of Nordic Baltic cooperation, not as a bloc or a coalition, standing coalition, but more as a regional grouping which in everyday practice seems to find liquid alliances on different issues, but is nevertheless perceived as having potential for initiating new debates in a more leadership role, where it can rest on pre-council, pre-European Council consultations amongst themselves, qualified as the iceberg of Nordic Baltic cooperation. Sovereignty, which was mentioned as being perceived by many of you as sort of zero-sum choice, with perhaps more mileage to be gained in Macron's concept of European sovereignty. And then, of course, in an institutional sense, Katharina, Marlene, Matti and Ilse have identified several institutional issues, of course, where more cooperation could be found, and especially for those non-Euro member states, it seems as closely as possible, at least, to buttressing the Eurozone as being in its own economic and financial interest. So, many more issues on the table as well. I have a few questions, but I would first like to give the opportunity to you to come up with any of your own. Please introduce yourself briefly and state your question to one of the panelists or the entire panel. Whom can I give the first and the second? Why did you start?
Hi, my name is Johannes Timm. I now work for the Goethe Institute here in Tallinn, but in a previous life I worked for the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. And I could not help think about the invocation of the Franco-German engine and how Nordic Baltic countries react to that. And I have a question for anybody who would like to answer it. My impression is when Macron first appeared on the scene and made his quite far-reaching proposals for European reforms, the Germans were very, very reluctant. And of course, I shouldn't say we, the German government has somewhat changed its position now and has gone along with some of the less far-reaching proposals that Macron has made. But my diagnosis would be that actually, under the current German government, Germany's position is more closer associated with some of the skepticism you have expressed from the Nordic Baltic position towards the reform proposals than it is really that we can really speak of a Franco-German engine in practical terms. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Can you pass the microphone on? Thank you.
This is Rina Kionka. I work for President Tusk in Brussels. Two questions to the panel. Ambassador Ruse talked about the fact that there are liquid, well, a lot of you talked about liquid dynamics and liquid coalitions, that there's no specific Nordic-Baltic coalition, but on certain issues there is a kind of coalition of thinking in the same direction. But that's no different from any other group of countries, any other format of countries in the European Union. If that's the case, then where do you see the added value of Nordic Baltic? Just to propose a provocative question in this particular conference. The second one is also somewhat hypothetical. If there were a situation, given what we all have heard about Nordic Baltic, thinking in a similar direction, even though there's no specific coalition, if there were, to be highly hypothetical, one political group who put forth a Nordic Baltic candidate to be the head of the president of the European Commission against a hypothetical German candidate for the European Commission head, what would win over the Nordic and Baltic governments, and what would be those factors? I'm not asking you to say what the response would be, because obviously you cannot, especially two of you, cannot say anything on this. But what would be the factors that go into the decision making, whether to go with, you know, a regional horse or the power horse? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Anyone else want to come in at this stage? Yes. Here, second row.
Thank you. I just want to come in after this question. I was asking myself...
Sorry,
and maybe,
can you introduce yourself?
Sorry, Doris Dandler. I'm the ambassador of Austria, a country that has never belonged to any club in the European Union. I don't know if it was voluntarily, but it's a fact. When I was reading the title, does the EU unite or divide the Nordic Baltic region, I was thinking I would put it the other way around. Does a group like the Nordic Baltic region divide the EU, to put something provocative in it? Do we, at the moment, cure the disease with an illness? Because what we are watching what my impression is at the moment, our big problem in the EU are divisions and fractions. And if I had learned anything in these 3 years here in Estonia, I learned that you need to learn and that you need to leave your regional comfort zone in the EU to understand some things that you might not be able to understand before. So do we now continue with blocks and groups, and do we sit around the table in these kind of fractions in the EU? That was my concern. Thank you.
Thanks for putting that. The general question, subtitle to the conference, also straight up. Could I ask Katarina to give, you know, your 2 cents on some of the questions or all of the issues that have been mentioned?
Well, I would reinforce the point being made by the Austrian ambassador, and I think I made it in my own presentation. Although we should pragmatically look for areas of cooperation within the region. And we share the Baltic geographic context, our closeness to Russia, many other issues. We should be careful not to be looked upon as a sort of a northern bloc against the, the southern European countries. I mean, France is changing, for one, and then tying into the question about French and German position. Let's not have some preconcepts about French positions. They are changing. They are becoming net contributors to the budget, for example. So they will look differently at on agricultural funds, structural funds, etc. And I think that, and of course, Germans and French would be the ones to explain their different positions. But I think that France and Germany would share the sense of need to address the lack in the architecture of the euro, as I was referring to in my initial talk and initial presentation. And then, of course, there will be tensions between Germany and France, reflecting just a different makeup. But sometimes there is also deliberate division of labor between France and Germany. Why don't you go ahead and make the position, and then I'll collect the herd. Germans will collect the herd, and of course we are very appreciative of Germany playing that role in the European Union. But sometimes there is, agreements being made between the two of who shall drive and who shall then collect the common position. So in that sense, I think I would assume that Germany and France share some very basic understanding of what the European Union need at this point. Also, the defense will be discussed later, so I will not preempt that discussion, but I think it's important to understand proposals for improved or deepened defense cooperation in the European Union, not as a competition with NATO, as Uffe Ellemann-Jensen was explaining yesterday at the dinner. This is, and there I think Angela Merkel and Macron, they would agree that, and as the rest of us, that Europeans have to take on a greater responsibility for security. Not only because the changes of US policies, the current administration, but just that it's more than 70 years has passed since the end of the Second World War. It's time for the Europeans to take on a greater share of responsibility. And the 2% that NATO professes in terms of spending our defense budget will be difficult for some nations to realize. And I think it would be politically difficult, may even be politically difficult for Germany to do that, not in terms of its relationship with Eastern neighbors, for example. So I think the European Union's proposals for creating defense funds, which, if they come through in the MFF, the multi-annual financial framework, will make the European Union one of the major investors in defense procurement and research, which would be a qualitatively very important development and one that is more easily realized than the adding automatic 2% of GDP.
We will talk more about this, of course,
I understand
this afternoon. Could you maybe address, Ilse, Rina's points?
With pleasure, and thank you for the question. Indeed, what is the added value of Nordic Baltic then, if there are floating coalitions? I think that we should be very clear about it, that each country presents in Council or on the EU level the position that is agreed nationally and approved by the national parliament. And this is very important, that each government is accountable to the national parliament, to voters, and also the position, therefore, has not much flexibility. And therefore, it's unlikely that there would be similar positions across the region, unless this is really a national interest, similar national interest of all countries. But where I see, and I try to also emphasize this during my intervention, that apart from these issue-level differences that in some cases may differ across the region, there are these leadership or initiative parts where the countries together in group can play a role. And I will give you an example. In 2009, after the Baltic parliamentarians in European Parliament came up with the idea we should possibly frame a macro-regional strategy for the Baltic Sea. This was taken by Swedish presidency, put in European Council conclusions. Then later Commission came out with a proposal, and so came the first macro-regional strategy for Europe, which has then later many successors. So I think this level of leadership, which was yesterday also pointed out by our keynote speaker, that there could be also Nordic-Baltic plus or Nordic-Baltic vision or leadership on issues where we see the value, the core value, strengths in our region. So therefore, I see this as a leadership thing, where we can unite us, because we are facing 2019 a new legislative cycle with the new programming, with the new high positions. So this was something that I intended also to emphasize. And then I also wanted to draw your attention to an article which was just in July published at Klingendal Institute, since I'm a resident in The Hague. Klingendal Institute researcher actually came out with an article in July, Why a New Hanseatic League Will Not Be Enough. And actually, he is also saying that it's not only one issue on which the alliance can exist. Therefore, I rather would see that we should speak about some kind of policy space which unites us, value space, and not an issue. Because there is one issue, but it's just this issue where we have this joint position paper. And finally, I have one example where Nordic Baltic is really showing very strong coherence. It's not in EU, it's in the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, where there is Nordic-Baltic constituency, which is actually on the rotation chairmanship, a secretariat in Washington, where the countries frame joint papers, joint strategies, not only on financial issues, but also on issues like climate change and migration. So there is still, I insist that there is a potential.
I was merely provoking you a little.
Thank you.
And I would assume, Marlene, you'll have to address the Austrian ambassador's question about, whether this leadership role on Nordic Baltic stronger coalition formation might actually be to the detriment of unity within the European Union. But before that, Matti, you may be in a more delicate position here to answer that particular question, although, who knows?
Trina provokes me on
the presidency issue?
It's each and every time we meet with her brilliant mind. Of course, any candidate for any top job in the EU, I mean, it's first you need to look at the personality, his or her previous experience, proven leadership, and so on. But it's of course. Any serious candidate to any top position in the EU next year needs to radiate this, or needs to have grasped the fundamental changes that have taken place in the Union since the big enlargement, since the fifth enlargement. How the union's geography and political geography has changed in the way that President Tusk radiates that and acts correspondingly all the time. If the Nordic Baltic region would have such a candidate, then let this candidate then face the, you were quoting a German candidate or whomever. It's my very personal view, of course, having seen some Nordic Baltic leaders and being at some meetings. I wouldn't have any problems with Helle Thorning-Schmidt running for an office in the EU.
Of course, I mean, political backing is important too. It's a point that Marlene made.
There's a long list of balances that need to be struck next year: geographical, political, gender, and so on. It'll be a very complex.
Sorry.
Big, small, small, of course, and I mean, if you ask for Nordic Baltic sort of feelings about this, of course, probably culturally we would prefer somebody who tends to take decisions at official meetings 9 a.m. rather than at informal dinners 9 p.m. But you can never have this fully in Brussels, I'm afraid.
Marlene, you made the point, your very last point, in fact, you know, there should be, leaders should be more outspoken about the populist, you know, tide. I put it slightly differently as one of the factors that Rina was asking for, you know, for a Nordic Baltic president's candidates basically to come to the fore, saying that, well, you need a certain political alignment in each of the governments in order to find commonality on a person, and you know that fits all the other, or ticks all the other boxes. I would rather, though, try and invite you to answer the. Is it a worry? Is it a concern, perhaps, that you expressed, or maybe just a genuine question about increased Nordic-Baltic cooperation, even if there is a bit of outreach to other regional groupings in the European Union, as perhaps a force for further fragmentation?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, but I think we have to look at this in a bird's perspective, also historically, that everybody agrees more or less that it's become impossible to make treaty change in the EU. All right, if we can agree on that it's close to impossible, and nobody has an appetite for that, what are the alternatives? The alternative is intergovernmentalism, meetings, outside meetings, countries making deals. I mean, I'm sorry to say, but this is the reality right now. and it's much less transparent, it's much less democratic, because nobody really knows why are we all of a sudden doing this, why are these two countries suggesting that, why are someone pushing for this or that solution. But the fact that we cannot agree on changing the institutions and people are fed up listening to institutional debates, I think we have to realize that modeling through is probably going to be the new black in Europe. And I think instead of just saying that's unacceptable, we have to find a way of avoiding that modeling through and coalitions, meetings behind closed doors or lunch meetings, countries meeting bilaterally increasingly, that is somehow taken out in the open, debated, discussed, that there is some kind of space for debating whether that's actually a good idea. Because otherwise it will be the first movers who all of a sudden have a suggestion for doing this or that or a third thing. And then we will be left on the perron, I don't know what's called in English, perron, on the platform, not really understanding or being able to influence very much in Europe. So yes, you can say blocks create maybe fragmentation in the sense that it keeps others out. But I think that in these times where everybody are in a block or trying to become or get into a block, I think that's what's happening right now. At least we saw our own foreign minister in Denmark, who he had one point on his agenda when he heard of Brexit, and that was to try to go around Europe to build new coalitions and to get new friends. He didn't succeed so well, one can see on this analysis, but it was really kind of almost desperate. He even went to Hungary, you know. I wrote a very upset op-ed on why on earth is he going there. I mean, we are trying to sort of tell Hungary that what it's doing is not right. But I think that we just have to realize that in light of not having the possibility to do big conventions, big treaty changes, what will happen is not a Europe that will stand still. We will have changes, and these changes will come from coalitions, debates outside the rooms, meetings, bilateral suggestions, ideas, people who are in the forefront with new ideas and visions. And the argument will be, well, you cannot prevent us, this group who wants this, to move ahead. So if you don't want, that's fine, but we will move ahead. And it's very hard to boycott a good initiative. This is something that Denmark, with all our opt-outs, is very much afraid of, that we cannot boycott the rest of the European members and say, you're not allowed to move further with developing the Eurozone or having a president of for finances, or even dividing the European Parliament into those who are part of the Euro or not. Cannot prevent that. But what do we do? I mean, we need somehow to try to influence this debate anyway, and doing it together with like-minded colleagues in the Nordic Baltic region, in my opinion, would be a very good option. We are stronger together than alone.
Thank you very much. The danger with a good panel like this is, of course, that we run out of time, as we have. I apologize for the poor timekeeping. The other danger is, of course, that not everything gets said by the panel. I think an implicit message which would come from, logically, a rotating presidency holder at this time is whether there might be any blocking minorities formed, and what topics might they be on the Nordic-Baltic axis, if there is such a coalition. I mean, migration was mentioned. The other question, which I think Matti threw up which remains unresolved, is how the future of Europe can be further developed and constructed without taking the citizens on board. Was it not all about this existential crisis, at least, in which the EU found itself, not more about generating more input legitimacy rather than always output legitimacy? And we focused again, I think, in this debate more on doing things for the people than rather with the people. So that would be an institutional aspect still worth exploring. And I think there might be more commonality there, perhaps with a trend in the Nordic, wider Northern Europe region, where there is more appetite, it seems, for referenda or forms of direct democracy, citizens' assemblies, etc., which might be worth exploring. Many more other issues. I will not attempt to conclude them now. In fact, we have a concluding session this afternoon, so I'll try and do my best there. For now, on your behalf, also a warm hand to the entire panel for their excellent contributions.
Housekeeping point, please be back at 11:20 for the next session. Enjoy the coffee.